Let me just get a couple of things out of the way to begin with. Yeah, there we go. Besides the ringing, I'm Caspian. I'm from Star Trek. That's what that effect is that you're hearing on my voice. I'm also Canadian. We do this all the time. And I work for a fairly large Canadian university. What I'm talking about today, if you're here for a financial management seminar, I'm sorry you came in too early. We're talking about asset configuration. Specifically, and Ian Amit, thankfully, is not here to laugh at me, specifically hardware, specifically desktops, because this is the biggest security footprint most organizations have, unless you're working in server management. And if you are, you might find this a little boring. I'm not talking about Elite Zero-Day hacks, and this is going to be a general introduction. So again, if you guys know more than me, and I would really be happy to hear from you if you do. If anybody in this room knows something that I don't, at the end of the conference, come tell me. It's probably going to take a long time, because I bet y'all do. So with that out of the way, let's start at the beginning. My definition of assets, as I said, not real estate, not money, just hardware. I will mention information assets a couple of times in this talk, completely separate thing. We can't configure information assets, that's the thing we have. And I'm covering Windows and OS X mostly because they're ubiquitous, they're popular, and mobile device asset configuration is a relatively new thing that's kind of difficult to do right now, doesn't integrate very well, and oh my god, there are so many different Android platforms that I can't keep track. So we're talking about configuration, OS, software settings, firmware, not a lot of hardware, because we'll get somebody else to do that in most cases. There are a couple of hypotheticals where that's not going to happen, but that's a different story. Here's the thing about this. If you came in here thinking you were going to actually learn something useful about red teaming, you are, but you probably already know it. You'll see, though. And this is an overview. I've got some reference material. It's not at the end of the deck right now. It will be when this deck is published, though. I'd love more, so as I said, at the end of the talk, please, if you've got something more, come talk to me. I'm going to get into the history, because I like history, and sometimes this is a little bit good to know where we are. The old hard method asset configuration, I work for a university that started its IT function in 1978. We were still running around using USB keys in 2003 to do a lot of our configuration. SneakerNet. Most of you in this room probably have heard of it or have done it. And you know, it existed in the old internet, MTV and telephones. That was a thing that they configured stuff as well. And it was often done by the IT team, guys like this guy, who really do understand your frustration. It wasn't very productive. It was a lot of exercise. But we move into the 20th century, 21st century, and everybody comes up with a new way of automating things, and it's kind of awesome, and Microsoft has got theirs, and Apple's got something. And it gets really complicated, and people make standards. And people make more standards, and some people don't like the first standard, so now you have N problems, where N is the number of organizations making standards today. The short answer to that actually is that it's at least 5, possibly more, depending on who you work for. So I like AD&D. I apologize if any of you are, not fans. This is going to come up. We're going to roll some dice. We've got some hypothetical organizations, archetypes. They're all feet and desks. We're going to start with NGOs and educational institutions. The reason I've put these in here is because maybe you don't work for them. I've worked for a lot, and none of these archetypes, by the way, are IT institutions. They're not doing consulting. They don't work with computers all day. They're not security people. These guys, in short, basically probably have a job where they're doing something that deals with human beings. They've got a lot of donated equipment, and they have a small budget. There's sometimes specialized software, depending on what they're doing, software or hardware. Some medical institutions I've worked with, this doesn't happen as much here, but up in the US, get really cool research equipment donated to them that only runs on embedded Windows ISA boards, embedded XP ISA boards, that you then have to get some sort of old ISA XP hardware and set up. And as the IT person in the organization, you're going to have to keep that running. As the CIO, if there is one, you're going to have to figure out how to make sure that that's actually properly secured and not representing a massive risk to your management. So we're looking at this, and I'm kind of thinking, okay, I've been into a couple of these. Some of them are think tanks, too. They're all over the place. Their IT guys are all over the place. You coming in as a consultant, you're seeing these IT guys being all over the place and kind of going, okay, what are you doing? Well, the IT guy, he doesn't go out and get training. He doesn't come to Circle CityCon. So they've got DHCP. It's a brand new thing. It might have been something that they suggested, a couple of years ago. They've been using Workgroup as their primary method of talking to Windows machines. They're running web servers off their desktops. And it basically is kind of defined in a lot of ways as bring your own damnation, or device, if you want. This is an organization where everybody brought in their own hardware to begin with, they cobbled it together, they set something up, and it works. That's at worst. At best, they now have a computer purchasing program where they're actually bringing new stuff in that's sort of standard. But the truth of the matter is, it's still just all over the place. It's not standardized at the moment. You've got, one office that's doing PR using a bunch of Macs, but the one guy who's decided that he needs to use Photoshop on the PC because of that one plugin, he's doing that and he has admin over the PC and can make it talk to a Mac, right? So it can be standardized. I've done this with a couple of organizations at this point. It always ends up in being one of these things where everybody hates you. That's cool, you're gonna leave. But you're standardizing it because that way when you do leave, they call you back to do incident response and help them out with the other stuff. The next one is the department. I could have called it the office, but that would have been an obvious joke. These guys don't do IT. They're a department inside a much larger organization. Pick 3 letters, it's probably one of those, but not IBM. And every one of these departments is a little fiefdom inside a kingdom. So if you've been in one of these, and probably some of you don't want to remember that you have, they don't really care what you're doing as long as the 2 guys that they put in charge of IT are okay with it, and the standardization that they set up somewhere on the back line with the software and their licenses are totally okay. They're not going to touch anything. And so the local IT guy is the guy who's responsible. Again, the local IT guy could be anybody, and the machines that they've got coming in are probably all, well, I mean, they might be that thing right there, or this thing right here, which I'm not trying to do product placement, that just happened that way. They're probably all bought from one source, they're probably all configured by one person. This is actually great, because you can do a lot with that. But they're not doing that right now. None of that is happening. In fact, the standardization is something that's a suggestion from management, and the IT team just does it their own way. You don't know that, though. On the inside, you look at it and you're like, well, okay, this is the way we do it in this office. We've never talked to anybody else in other departments. That's how it works. If it's already standardized, great. I'm not using that right now as a hypothetical, but that happens a lot more now. I don't really work in the corporate arm of things anymore, but when I did, they were on the verge of doing that, and it was really cool to see. So we're going to assume that it isn't for now, just because this is much better for our role-playing game that we play later. The last one is the startup or small, medium business. We call them petit et moyenne entreprises in Quebec because French, it's the same thing. Again, we're going to assume they don't do IT. We're basically looking at a cross between the last 2, except there's more of the bring your own damn device, and a lot of crosstalk between machines, a lot of people sharing things, a lot of dynamic workplace stuff going on, but everybody has admin over their desktops. And it's possible that the network is wide open. Who knows? In this case, I'm going to say that it is, just because it makes things a little bit easier for me. Let's say they do engineering. Again, they have 10 to 1,000 people. You're talking 10 to 1,000 desktops. There's probably a lot of different ideas of how they want to network those things. They're probably running LDAP or Active Directory or something like that. They probably ran something they got for free that they don't necessarily know how to work. And then the stuff at the bottom with the exclamation marks. There's a home router. I mean, I don't know if you guys have done this, but every place I've gone into that was smaller than 100 people never actually bought a switch. They went out to Best Buy or, Walmart and got the nearest home router that they could afford, plugged that into their ADSL or cable modem, and that's their access. So they're basically right out there on the internet with a bunch of hardware that's easily accessible. Well, that's going to be part of not our network configuration, but that's actually also going to affect our baseline. Our baseline configuration has to take that into account. And this ties into some stuff where we talk about threat intelligence, which I'm going to just glance over for a second, because all of this stuff is basically a question of where you are and what your clients are looking at or what your organization is looking at. So it's not a one-size-fits-all thing. It's part of the reason I'm going through this. Anyway, back to our small, medium business. It's chaotic. Nothing's automated. Everything's all over the place. Everybody programs their own stuff. It's great, except when you're charged with protecting the place, because then you have no idea what's going on in each one of these machines. And it really isn't different from the other two I just mentioned, except for the picture, obviously, with the zombies and the shoes. So there are a bunch of common traits between these. One of them is their threat environments at their base. And again, I'm going to mention Ian because I saw his presentation and it was great. He talked about the idea of general threat information, the stuff that should be free, the stuff that comes with your antivirus and that sort of stuff. That's right in there. And endpoint protection's got to be a part of this baseline for most of these people because the antivirus and the endpoint protection are actually going to give you a better idea of how to respond to some of your incidents. But they're also going to give you some of the general threat information. The next thing is theft. We don't talk about this that much in a lot of the technical presentations at the conferences I've been in, but theft is a huge risk. Theft destroys national intelligence programs. So if it's doing that to a national intelligence program, think about what it can do to an organization. Someone steals a laptop with some really, really hot intellectual property on it, and if you're a small or a medium business or a startup, well, that's your baby's gone. Bye. Then there's the whole Wi-Fi thing, and you guys might be in hotels a lot. I know I am once in a while. Do you ever do the thing where you just scan to see who's got an open share on Wi-Fi? Yeah, you don't. Okay, you're nice. The little girl in the front, do you do that? Okay. There was an article that ran a little while ago, and I couldn't find a copy of it, a screenshot or a shot of it, but somebody in Calgary had done this at a hotel, and it made national news in Canada because we're a boring country. And the article was this really long scare piece about how you shouldn't do that, especially if you're a lawyer, because the woman who was discovered doing this was a lawyer or a doctor, and she had a bunch of confidential information on the machine, and the guy talked to her, and she went to the press to talk about this, because initially she had called the cops saying that he was hacking into her machine. The thing is that the cops aren't going to help you if you left your front door open. They're just going to say, well, come on, Nathan, you left your front door open. So we've got the Wi-Fi issue, we've got the open shares, we've got the theft, we've got the viruses and the worms in your tubes clogging your internets. And then the last thing is access control. This actually ties into the first thing. I also just skipped the they don't compliance bro because I figure you guys all read that. So access control is kind of a big deal for a lot of reasons. One of them is remote desktop, especially if you're running a network that allows remote desktop access. I've had issues with this, and I'm going to just tell you guys a little story about it because I like stories. When I first got to my current job, I got called for an incident response that lasted 2 weeks. It was long and kind of unpleasant, and we couldn't figure out what was going on. And what was actually going on, this is the short version, is the firewall guy noticed a ton of data exiting our network. Gigs of data. And he said, well, it's going to Turkey and Brazil. This is problematic because we don't work with them. We don't really know what's going on. So I went and looked. It was coming from the president's office. Oh my God, this is already kind of scary. And what was happening, because we'd already, prior to me getting there, people had actually set up a couple of configuration baselines for things like logging, for example, and how RDP was working. RDP had been left on. This automated agent was accessing remote desktop and trying to brute force its way through our administrator password. And the gigs of data that were exiting were it reloading the screen over hours and hours of time. And that's all it was. When we actually went into the analysis, nothing had been touched on the inside. It didn't get through because we also don't configure our networks to use administrator as a default account for anything. Who the heck would do that? Anybody? No? Okay. So this is just one of these situations where, and we're going to get into this a little bit later, where this is actually going to be something that makes a difference. I've got another one, and I'll explain it later on. You guys probably heard of the virus that was related to this. So common traits for these organizations, they're pretty normal. If you're going to do a saving throw against them and you're a superhero, you're probably going to win. They're not going any further than most people because really, the question organizationally is, what's it going to cost me and how much work do I have to do? And usually if the answer is money and any work at all, probably not unless there's a significant impact associated with it. And usually the significant impact is it's going to make us more money, not it's going to save us from getting our butts kicked or have a PR disaster, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So for this, the message that actually gets delivered in a lot of cases when I bring this to people or when my colleagues do is, we're going to configure your systems, we're going to set everything up so it's homogenized. What it's going to do is save you a couple of thousand a year in work. We don't mention anything about the security side of it because, frankly, most of the time the people who hear that are going to go, well, you're going to be able to see into our systems and read what we're doing. No, we don't want to do that. We're not. That's not our job. So, yeah, these guys are normal people, and their business side is a normal business side, which means you've got to work through that. Thus, deliver it not as a security message, but a configuration message. So, our characters are normal people and they need some help. Obviously, they're going to go visit some wizards because that's what you do when you're on a quest, right? They're going to go climb some mountains and maybe do some other things. And the first wizard they visit is Twitbor, the wizard in the tower who has really boring clothes, otherwise known as Microsoft. Yeah, Microsoft. You guys have probably all seen the Microsoft standard configuration baseline thing. If you haven't, I encourage you to go look at it. It's a very large spreadsheet. It will make your eyes hurt. There's lots of different recommended configurations for lots of different things, and this is going to be a recurring theme in at least 2 places in the next 10 minutes. The problem with it is that a lot of those configurations are very specific. They've got 2 configurations that really matter. One of them is the one that is on the machine when you buy it, and the other one is the one that you set up. Everything else is just a suggestion, because the rest of this stuff is all for reference. If you're going to use it right as a default template from them, you're basically going to be entering a territory where you're trying to put on a pair of one-size-fits-all pants. It's not going to work. So there's that, and the other thing is that despite that, they still have some really great and useful stuff here. First of all, we're not using XP anymore, so the whole myth of Microsoft being wildly insecure is only partially true. And by 7.1, they'd actually updated a lot of their security configurations and baseline configuration just as stock standard to be good enough for at least one person running a home router so that they wouldn't get owned within 2 minutes of putting the machine on the network. I'm not going to talk about Vista. I think NIST has a guide out for securing Vista, and I think it might be this thick because it's a NIST guide, but I'm trying to avoid Vista because it's bad for my diet. So they've got a security baselining tool that works really well for Windows 7.1. It works for their servers too. You may have used it for their servers if you work with them. It works for a lot of other stuff. And what's handy about it is that the meta suggestions that come out of it are useful. You can apply them. You can't generically apply them. There are risks to generically applying them. And you're going to need to do a lot of reading, because if you do it wrong, it could turn off Kerberos, for example, and then Active Directory won't work, then your shares won't work, and everything is just going to go, oh, we don't know who to talk to. And I put a little, this is a completely hypothetical graph for our hypothetical heroes of how things are going to work. There's a lot of work involved. The group that I worked with who actually just recently did a baseline configuration for Windows 4, I think it was 30,000 machines, we spent 2 years just working on the specific security switches because you bring it into your test environment and you run it up against your test AD server and your test replicated network, and you discover everything's working fine except for that one plugin for Photoshop that breaks, that is totally necessary for that one guy in the comms office who needs to be able to make good PR. Please don't ever use that in anything ever, because it is really kind of slanderous to Microsoft, and while they probably deserve it, it's probably also not fair because it's not very accurately sourced. Then we've got Apple, the next wizard. We call them the turtleneck wizards who live in the valley. They did have configuration standards back when they weren't trying to ship a new version of OS X every 5 minutes and making phones for a living. The last version was 10.6, so I think it was, what was it, Tiger, Hello Kitty. The 10.6 was actually cooperated with the NSA, and I mentioned the NSA in the abstract if you guys read it. I don't know if you did. I'm not really going to talk about them much because they're basically shadow wizards at this point. They've got a bunch of really good configuration tips, but they don't actually have full baseline guides. At one point, I think they did, because I remember reading them. I distinctly remember reading them. That was a long time ago, and there have been a lot of DEF CONs in between. 10.6 is a little out of date because a lot of the stuff that the Apple guys mentioned in it don't exist on Apple computers anymore. They changed their operating system pretty heavily. They've changed their hardware configurations pretty heavily in the last couple of years. The other thing that's sort of monstrous about Apple for baseline configuration is that they also changed their hardware without telling you. So if you're working for an organization, contracting for them or whatever, and you're trying to apply some of this stuff, and you say, okay, we're going to do a standard monolithic configuration where we just build an Apple machine out of a donor machine, the way we would with Windows XP or Windows whatever, we clone them. You can't do that. And the reason you can't do that is because every time they revise their hardware quarterly, you're going to get a different graphics driver on it. The thing running the SSD, if there is an SSD, is going to be different. The RAM might be different. The configuration will actually cause things to fail. They don't talk about this because it's not necessary. They're a vertically integrated organization, so what they give you out of the factory is the only thing you're going to get. And if you want to do hardware configuration with Apple, you've got to work with an intermediary who is kind of in their pocket. The upside, though, is it works pretty well out of the box. And they've got some Active Directory integration where it will maybe map over on a good day if the moon is right and the weather is blowing just in that, or the wind is blowing in that right direction so that nothing shifts too much. And it's also still basically BSD underneath, so if you know BSD, Apple's not hard, you can script pretty much everything. The other good thing, and I don't know if this is actually mentioned in the next slide, and I don't think it is because I have it here. Yeah, the other good thing, there we go, is that there's a really, really strong open source community supporting Apple Office configurations now, as much as Apple doesn't really care about it. So there's a group that came up with something awesome called Deploy Studio. This one will actually monolithically configure machines. There's also Monkey, and if you've heard about that, great. If you haven't, I encourage you, if you're working with OS X boxes, to look it up. It's basically equivalent of SCCM, which I didn't mention in the Microsoft side for Macs. It's a system configuration utility. It's open source. It's easier to configure than SCCM, and it works super well. There's also Apple Remote Desktop, ARD, which I'm going to refer to a couple of times here because that comes standard with Apple. It's okay. Unfortunately, it also, if it's set up properly, exposes a lot of data and leaves things fairly open on a network. So you need to kind of do the outer layer of the onion much better. Depending on who you're working for, that might not be a case. The educational organization, for example, they don't know how to configure the outer layer of their onion, or they don't have a guy who's doing that 100% of the time. Or if they do, they've got everything open and it's just touching everything. So then there's NIST. The grand high wizards on the great big mountain, and I'd like to thank all of you in this room who are not Canadian for paying taxes, because we're using your standards. NIST actually wrote the book that we use in our country for most of this, and cooperate with a lot of people, me included, but I usually do it on the medical IT side, to build really awesome stuff. That said, they don't really make baselines anymore either. The last one they made was for Windows Vista. I said it again. And they've got one out that they've been maintaining for XP up until I think it was 2009, which is kind of fantastic because if you think about it, Windows XP and it's 2009, just wow. They do, however, maintain checklists. And this is actually part of a much larger US government thing for checklists. 1 minute? Okay. And their checklists are epic. So they like letters and numbers. If you're going to go through this, 800-128 is a good starting point. It's a management guide, though. 853, that's the config management, and then 870 is a national checklist program. The checklist program, like the Microsoft one, super useful, full of good information. However, they're still hard to automate. I went and checked this before coming here. 291 checklists for different asset configurations. 95 of them will work with the software automation, the software control and automation protocol, but 9 are validated by NIST to do this, and then 114, which is a little less visible on my screen, but better up there, are actually non-automated XML, so we're right back to the sneaker net with Butthead going, I understand your pain. Loads of useful references, default compliance setups, it's easy to automate, and it ties in with ITIL, CMMI, and ISO. There are also a lot of important looking letters. Your boss will be happy. Right, so let's talk about old, ugly technology. I'm going a little fast because I was just told I've got a minute left. Asset tracking applications. They don't work very well. If you're going to install them as part of a configuration baseline, I'd suggest don't. You're going to be better off using something like SCCM. Yes, it costs money. Pay for it. It's worth it. And GLPI, which doesn't, or ARD, which exposes information, but it's still better than having a GPS tied to your computer so that when it gets stolen and turned off, you still can't find it, and you spent a lot of money on LoJack. Whole disk encryption. Yes, use it. And you can run that as part of a GPO that you push via an Active Directory server. You can also do it on ARD or a baseline configuration for Apple. This is already a good start. The only reason people don't use it in a lot of cases is fear, and it sucks. Unfortunately, we have issues with people saying, oh, well, there's a key escrow issue. We don't know what to do if you lose a password. Well, yeah, but you know, if I drop your laptop, it's also going to lose the data. So we've got this alphabet soup of configuring things. It's kind of great. And if you've got more than 5 machines on a network, you should probably be using some of these. And we've got some enemies, our hypothetical monsters, network attacks. So I'm going to start with one thing, and I'm going to harp on it: logging. Logging. We can see lots of stuff going on a network attack on a desktop in the logs. In terms of random activity going on the hardware, CPU spikes, that sort of thing. You can engage the same server monitoring tools that you might be using on a desktop. Why not? The other thing is that sometimes OS X is doing things like blacklisting IPs. So we're already in a good place here. If you've done a baseline configuration that allows whitelisting and blacklisting, your hypothetical monsters are less of a problem. So our NPO and our small business who did that, they're not getting beaten by the network attack. The other thing is that changing RDP to turn it off in SSH, again, we're not getting beaten by the network attack. The last one is the endpoint protection solutions. This used to be called an antivirus. There's a much more fantastic name for it because now it's got a bunch of stuff integrated. And if you look at the NIST baseline, they actually suggest this. Use all the stuff. You've got a personal firewall on there. You've got disk encryption. You've got everything. It works. And again, the network attack is less of a problem. The insider threat, I apologize to Anonymous if any of you wear masks in this room. I couldn't find a guy in a balaclava wearing a suit, typing on a keyboard. Separation of duty and access control. Oh my God, we just configured that using a baseline configuration. And the Microsoft Secure Spec, which I mentioned, breaks a lot of stuff, does, however, limit a lot of stuff too. So if you're applying that properly, hey, guess what? You don't have to worry about this half as much. Oh, also logging. Did I mention logging? I'm going to say this again. On the Apple side, you're going to basically sudo su and run a bunch of scripts. But you can still do it, and you can do it really well. And again, this limits the insider threat. You can block media, and I didn't mention this earlier because it should be obvious, but you can block media. You can also do that at the dev level, a device level on an Apple machine. You can't do that as much on a Windows machine, but it's still possible. And then there's file integrity and log integrity. All this stuff you can basically apply via baseline. No problem. Most of it is pushable by GPO at this point, and when it's not, it's an application that you're basically getting your vendor to install first. The last one, oh God, how did this get here? I am not good at computers. Again, we go back to integrity checks and logging. We also go to user education. The problem with user education is we can't do that with a GPO push. You can't just GPO your users. All right. And the end of this is, I'm going to put the rest of the deck up on, sorry I ran over time. DIY is better for 3 reasons. One, you can do an autopsy on something you understand. You can't do an autopsy on something you can't. You can iterate your baselines, and knowing what you built is super important because that way you can actually run it. I'd like to thank you all. I'm on Twitter as Random Interrupt, and we don't have time for questions. Shoot them to me on Twitter or talk to me afterwards.